Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to our second part of our final conference of the MICROBOL project. Now we are ready to share the recommendations from our project concerning quality assurance, recognition, and qualification frameworks and ECTS with you. Therefore, we have our project partners here at the table together with us. And we will first give the floor to Elena Sirlan of EUA. She will be followed on the topic of recognition by Chiara Finocchietti from Cimea, Italy. And third, but not least in the row, will be Jonna Koronen from the Finnish Ministry of Education and Culture, and she will talk about the qualification frameworks and ECTS. But first, I will give the floor to Elena. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Magali, and good afternoon, everyone. So indeed, I will go deeper now into quality assurance of microcredentials and what has been discussed and agreed within the working groups that we had. And first, as you know, the main question of the project was to see if the HEA tools are applicable and to what extent, if they need to be actually amended so that they are applicable to microcredentials. And the question was answered regarding ESG in the sense that ESG are applicable to microcredentials, and they apply to all higher education offered in the HEA in whatever format and duration or mode of delivery, and institutions are expected, of course, to include all education provision into their internal quality assurance. Now I will go into the matters of internal quality assurance and what were the main recommendations of the working groups. Here I will go through the first one, and mainly that the primary responsibility for the quality of provision lies with the higher education institutions. May I ask, please, for the technical staff to stop the transition of the slides, if that's possible. They are transiting a bit by themselves. Okay, while the technical staff will help me with that, I will go forward. So according to the ESG, of course, the primary responsibility, as said, lies with the providers. And in case of higher education institutions that are higher education institutions, if considered, of course, other providers, it means that they have the main responsibility to put in place mechanisms for quality assurance. And of course, when it comes to higher education institutions, they have to have in place quality assurance processes as laid down in part 1 of the ESG. And that means that they should consistently apply the predefined and published regulations covering all phases of a student life cycle. And that, of course, includes certification. And here, as Magali already presented, here come all the constitutive elements of the certificates. And of course, that also internal quality assurance should cover that as well. Then all microcredentials should be subject to internal quality assurance, and of course there should be well-built systems to monitor the quality of these microcredentials, as there are also for regular programs that are offered by higher education institutions. And here a special attention was given in the group discussions to microcredentials that are standalone and are not part of any program or are not aligned to any program. And it was agreed that maybe the standalone microcredentials would require actually some different approaches when it comes to internal quality assurance. Then, of course, as we always say, transparency and clarity of policy and information is crucial. And, of course, higher education institutions should publish this, should make it clear to the students, to the learners, about microcredentials, how they are quality assured internally. And last but not least, of course, as in the case of any learning provision, learners should be included in all steps of development, implementation, and all other QA processes for micro-credentials. Now I will move to external quality assurance, and when it comes to this, of course, QA agencies have quite a role here to play, and they need to support higher education institutions in developing policies and processes for quality assurance, to ensure the public that, and stakeholders, here we have stakeholders as well as learners, that all the internal quality assurance mechanisms are effective. And of course, within the evaluation, external evaluation of micro-credentials, quality assurance agencies should address internal quality assurance and see if there are needed policies in place, if all the mechanisms fall together. Then adding to that, of course, an important conclusion of the working group was that the application of procedures for program evaluation, for external program evaluation, shouldn't be followed for micro-credentials, because these are too detailed for micro-credentials that are shorter, and they may burden not only the quality assurance agencies, but also the higher education institutions. So a different approach has to be found and has to be applied. Then, of course, as said, there are different types of micro-credentials, and quality assurance agencies should think if it needs to be considered how to evaluate standalone micro-credentials vs micro-credentials that are part of a bigger program, and the same online mode delivery vice face-to-face delivery. When it comes to legal aspects, of course, national governments should explore whether a change in legislation is needed, and in case it is needed, then plan the relevant changes, exchange information with other countries, explore good practices and experiences at international level, provide support to higher education institutions, and incentivize higher education institutions in developing and providing micro-credentials. And of course, when doing all this, respecting and considering institutional autonomy, so to allow for diversity and creativity. For the way forward, of course, as already discussed, it is important that we all have the same understanding of what a micro-credential is. And for this, looking forward, or a key way to move things would be to put together key considerations for quality assurance of micro-credentials, and to explore alternative providers, how they interact with higher education institutions, how they partnership with these, and how to actually assure the quality of micro-credentials offered in partnerships. And in this picture, of course, we should look also at how employers actually take micro-credentials and how they recognize those workers that come with micro-credentials in their environments. Develop a guiding book, including a set of guidelines for good practices for higher education institutions, promote transparent and clear guidelines also for quality assurance agencies. I see my slides are dancing around, and I hope with a smile on your face I will end this presentation saying that, of course, as Bagali also said, it's important that we keep collaborating on this subject, that we have opportunities to peer learn and to exchange ideas on how we move forward. And with these words, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena. Let's go to a few questions from the audience online. We have a question on the provision of micro-credentials, whether the use of EDCL or Europass is a must criterion, or can other systems also be used as in terms of the wallets? Do you have any ideas on that?
Of course, it's not a must, but it, you know, these may help for recognition purposes, because they will allow for transferability of information, for portability of information. So it's not that anyone imposes something, you know, it's rather that we look at the tools that may facilitate what we already have in place as processes.
Regarding standalone programs, what approach for quality assurance do you suggest there? Do you have any specific remarks on standalone micro-credentials, I suppose that she's meaning here?
Yeah, well, when it comes to internal quality assurance and external quality assurance, of course, the best procedures that fit very well micro-credentials are the procedures that look at the whole institutional quality assurance. So the institutional evaluations. When it comes to micro-credentials that stand alone from programs, it means that they have no relationship with already prepared programs, and it means that there should be in place some specific criteria to follow for those standalone micro-credentials. And those criteria usually wouldn't overlap, as in case for a micro-credential that is linked to a program.
Just to continue, would you be a bit more concrete about some items on your wish list concerning the support given by QA agencies? What would you expect of them? Could you elaborate a little bit more in detail what your expectations are there?
Well, of course, one of the expectations is that quality assurance agencies will, as they have been, be very supportive to higher education institutions. And I would also wish that quality assurance agencies act as advocates as well when it comes to putting together good policies in place. And of course, quality assurance agencies play a huge role as stakeholders, so they should be involved in any discussions along with higher education institutions and policymakers.
All right, then I got a question from Maciej. Could you expand a bit on the issue of the application of the ESG 1.2? I know, Elena, you're much more aware of all of them than I am. Is it much more applicable than the expectation to include learners in the micro-credential design process, is the question. So I think we want to know a little bit more about the inclusion of learners in the design process of micro-credentials in relation also, of course, to the quality assurance aspect.
Well, ESG 1.2 is about developing programs and their learning outcomes, ECTS, and alignment with NQFs. And these aspects will be soon discussed and presented by my colleagues. So just a little bit of patience there. But when it comes to involvement of learners, good question, and I think because of my slides dancing around, I didn't touch upon that. So it was discussed that in case of micro-credentials, involving learners is a bit of a challenge, because learners may include regular students and a bigger group of learners, meaning adult learners, learners that already are involved in job market, or and so on and so forth. So here, the job of higher education institutions would be to identify the needs of these learners, of course, and to make sure that they are involved not only in collecting their feedback, but also when developing micro-credentials. We all agreed in the working group discussions that this may be a challenge for future, but there should be a balance still found.
Could you expand a bit on the issue of the application of the ESG 1.2? I know, Elena, you're much more aware of all of them than I am. Is it much more applicable than the expectation to include learners in the micro-credential design process, is the question. So I think we want to know a little bit more about the inclusion of learners in the design process of micro-credentials in relation also, of course, to the quality assurance aspect.
Well, ESG 1.2 is about developing programs and their learning outcomes, ECTS, and alignment with NQFs. And these aspects will be soon discussed and presented by my colleagues. So just a little bit of patience there. But when it comes to involvement of learners, good question. And I think because of my slides dancing around, I didn't touch upon that. So it was discussed that in case of micro-credentials, involving learners is a bit of a challenge, because learners may include regular students and a bigger group of learners, meaning adult learners, learners that already are involved in job market, or and so on and so forth. So here, the job of higher education institutions would be to identify the needs of these learners, of course, and to make sure that they are involved not only in collecting their feedback, but also when developing micro-credentials. We all agreed in the working group discussions that this may be a challenge for future, but there should be a balance still found.
Thank you, Elena. I think that's our time for now, and I think we should go to the next speaker, Chiara Finocchietti.
Thanks. Good afternoon also from my side. My task is to briefly present what we've been discussing in the working group in the MICROBOL working group that had the task to look to micro-credential from the recognition, from the point of view of the recognition key commitment. For this reason, one of the first points we have been looking through is the coverage and the link with the Lisbon Recognition Convention. And one, let's say, point of consensus is that as far as possible, micro-credentials should be assessed according to the principle of the Lisbon Recognition Convention. Of course, as was said at the very beginning of this conference today, these outcomes are actually a beginning of the work. So we still have some work in front of us. And looking to micro-credential from the recognition perspective, one point is to further clarify and make explicit to what extent micro-credential awarded by higher education institution can fall in the remit, in the scope of the Lisbon Recognition Convention definition. As we can see, there are two definitions, and the consensus in the group is that those definitions cover micro-credential awarded by higher education institution either as a period of study or as a qualification, where for qualification, according to the Lisbon Recognition Convention, we mean any degree, diploma, or certificate issued by a competent authority attesting the successful completion of a higher education program. Of course, speaking about Lisbon Recognition Convention, it's easier and more natural for micro-credential awarded by a higher education institution. When we look to micro-credential awarded by non-formal providers, of course the lack of legal instrument can leave more uncertainty and can leave the question of admission and recognition predictability open. In this sense, one point we discussed in the group is that, for instance, recognition agreement among providers, among higher education institution and education provider at regional and cross-regional level may be relevant for recognition purpose. One example, of course, is the one also of university alliances that have been discussed previously with Kinga. When we spoke about further work on the coverage of Lisbon Recognition Convention, we mean, for instance, look a little bit more in depth to principle and concepts such as substantial difference. If we can speak of substantial differences looking to microcredential, what they could be, etc. So in general terms, the consensus was that we should work in the direction to streamline the procedure of recognition in line with the Lisbon Recognition Convention principle and have a flexible approach when we look to microcredential. It's worth to mention that we do not start from scratch. There are already a number of initiatives, projects in the framework of the ENIC-NARIC networks that we can look at to explore synergies, to take inspiration from. One example, just to quote one, is the Evaluate project that can offer some guidance on recognition of non-traditional learning and in this sense also to microcredential. So looking to recommendation, it is relevant to, as we say, to make explicit to what extent microcredential can fall within the scope of the Lisbon Recognition Convention. So work more in this direction to clarify what could be the legal ground for the academic recognition on microcredential. And explore the need for a subsidiary text if this is needed. Another point is to, as we say, to explore the possibility of recognition agreement that could be a concrete tool to support recognition of microcredential, and also to the other recommendation is to support the daily practice of recognition of microcredential. One way to do this is to consider the possibility to include a chapter in the European Area of Recognition Manual that was mentioned, the first edition was mentioned in the Bucharest Communique in 2012, in the EHEA Bucharest Communique in 2012, and now the new edition is in progress. Recognition of microcredential in line with the Lisbon recognition principle is possible when all the constitutive elements are properly displayed. When there is not enough evidence of information regarding learning outcomes, regarding the microcredential, there is still the possibility, still possible to recognize microcredential through recognition of prior learning. And actually, this was one of the points of discussion in the group. Microcredential could give a boost, in a sense, to renew the discussion and to reinforce the use of recognition of prior learning in higher education. And this could be very useful for recognition of small volume of formal or non-formal learning, especially learning coming from industry, from private providers. Actually, one point of discussion was also that microcredential could also be, let's say, the output of recognition of prior learning process. So it could be the formal credential that give information on the learning outcomes that the learner has. One other point of discussion is that there are already some good practices in the field, and practices regarding qualification of refugees with partial or missing documentation could be also seen as an example from to look at, to take inspiration. And this could be one of the other points to be further looked at in the future. So looking to recommendation regarding recognition of prior learning, the recommendation is to use validation of learning outcomes from non-formal and informal learning only in cases where a microcredential is absent or does not provide enough reliable evidence on the learning outcomes. The second point is to develop procedures for the validation of learning outcomes from non-formal and informal learning that are fit for purpose. Of course, we should develop tools that do not overburden higher education institutions and learners. And finally, we should work more in the direction of do training and experience sharing, also on recognition of prior learning in order to recognize learning outcomes from non-formal and informal learning. So looking to the way forward, one of the main, let's say, outcome of the group is that transparency of information is key for fair assessment of microcredentials. So nothing new, but it's very important to work in the direction to offer and to support transparent information, because this is central in order to support fair assessment of microcredential. So we should, let's say, work in the direction to give all the information needed to have the recognition circle work properly. If all the constitutive elements are properly displayed, the constitutive elements that Magali presented earlier this afternoon, it is possible for higher education institution or other entities to assess microcredential in line with the Lisbon Recognition Convention principle. And this was already mentioned, the digitalization can be a relevant tool to support fast and fair recognition. And also from the recognition perspective, we see this point of learner-centered, also from the digitalization point. So the learner should have the possibility to easily share his or her microcredential. And let's say the main conclusion where we still have to work is to work in the direction that recognition of microcredentials should be as automatic as possible, starting off, of course, from cases where all the elements, all the constitutive elements and all the information are available to conduct a fair assessment. So this will be all from my side, and I'm happy to answer questions, if any.
Yes, there are a few questions from the audience online. Please do continue to pose any questions if you have them, of course, in the chat box. I have a few questions linked to other institutions than higher education institutions, in fact, so I'm going to bundle them. How could recognition of microcredentials from non-higher education institutions providers be facilitated without creating cumbersome procedures, like in the recognition of prior learning? And I'm going to combine that question with another question, which is that only higher education institutions are allowed to award ECTS, and for other institutions, shouldn't it also be ensured that they state the working hours or additional information alongside learning outcomes? So yeah, a few questions together regarding how to work with non-higher education institutions in terms of recognition.
Thanks. Of course, this is the most challenging part and the part where we still have quite some work in front of us. Let's say, in this sense, we see cooperation as very relevant to work in the direction of support fair recognition of microcredential. We, in the group, we defined this with recognition agreement, but in general, it is very important to share information and practices also with, let's say, providers other than higher education institutions. It will be important, especially for those providers, to work in this direction of transparent information provision. So this will be probably one of the key points to work with. So to work in the direction of a culture, let's say, of recognition that can be supported by providing all the necessary information. And the second question was about, can you...
Well, it was very linked, so whether learning hours should specifically also be stated.
Yes, thanks. So, of course, in this sense, it is very important in this transparent information also to use the correct wording. So, of course, when an higher education institution award a microcredential and use ECTS, we are referring to something very precise. I will say that it is very important to express workload. This will be very important for a microcredential awarded from private providers. This is also one of the elements of the evaluate methodology, one of the 7 criteria to look at for recognition of microcredentials. So it will be important to know what is the workload.
Thank you, Chiara. That's actually it for the questions for now. So I think all you explained was very clear. And let's continue now to our next speaker, who's Jonna Korhonen, who will elaborate further on the qualifications, frameworks and ECTS.
Thank you, and good afternoon also from my behalf. I will now touch upon the two very relevant Bologna tools that we have available when we have been discussing about the micro-credentials in the context of higher education sector, so higher education institutions and how they are developing and using the micro-credentials. I will first talk a little bit about the qualification frameworks. So first of all, this work is based on the discussions we had within the working group, and the discussion was very fruitful. We had a lot of opinions, a lot of different kind of developments taking place in different countries. But in the end, the main result agreed between the working group members was that we saw that the QF-EHEA is in principle fit for purpose also when addressing micro-credentials. And by this QF-EHEA, we of course refer to the overarching framework for qualifications within the European higher education area. And this framework consists of cycles, first cycle, second cycle, third cycle, and the optional short cycle. And these cycles describe it in terms of learning outcomes and competencies through general descriptors, and also in terms of typical ECTS credit ranges. So they are fit for purpose, but we also do reckon that there are still some issues that we need to discuss when we take our steps forward. One of the issues is, of course, that we reckon that the descriptors of the QF-EHEA refer to the completion of a cycle. And of course, in many cases, we can already say that it's quite rarely when the learning outcomes of the micro-credentials would actually mark a completion of a cycle. So in this respect, it is very important to be very clear and transparent how micro-credentials are represented within the QF-EHEA. And also in this way, it is very linked to the fact how the national qualifications frameworks are developed, used, and implemented at the national level. So the developments that are taking place at the national level currently in terms of micro-credentials and the questions that we are addressing in terms of the QF-EHEA are very much interlinked together, and we must take this forward together. In this respect, we also discussed a lot about the learning outcomes in the group, and we thought that actually the learning outcomes approach is necessary. I have put the may help, but actually it could be formulated that it's necessary when we develop the micro-credentials further and when they are included in the NQFs. And here, of course, we refer to the NQF level descriptors that can be used as a generic statements of the competencies, skills, and knowledge that the micro-credentials are to be delivered by different higher education institutions. But at the same time, we do want to emphasize the fact that decision whether the micro-credentials are to be included in the national qualification frameworks or not is taken at the national level. So each country, member state of the European higher education area thinks about this question currently, I assume, because they were already thinking during the working group period, and we have a bit different kind of stages in different countries. And here, of course, the exchanges between us has been very helpful in this regard. But if the micro-credentials are included into NQF, there should be some kind of principles decided and also criterion. such as naming or size or value or stackability, issues like that. And this is, of course, something that could be and should be taken forward when microcredentials discussion is taken forward after this project, for example. It is important that the microcredentials, if they are put into a QF-ETA, they are distinguished from the actual qualifications, actual degrees. So this is what we wanted to emphasize when we discuss the issue. And in the recommendation for the qualification frameworks, you can see that we recommend that the European discussion and national solutions should be taken forward simultaneously. So we need to see how we are interlinked together, and we need to listen to the way the European discussion is taken forward at the same time at the national level. And we also say that the microcredentials should be included in the national qualification frameworks when possible. We also do see that in some cases this might not be possible, or this might not actually be even needed. And in this regard, we emphasize the fact that the learning outcomes might be actually sufficient, especially when we talk about small microcredentials, to indicate, you know, to which level they have been kind of developed separately from the degrees. And then, of course, you know, guidelines and common principles for implementing microcredentials should be developed at the national European level. And at the time we developed the recommendations, and now that we are publishing the framework, we were still discussing a lot about the definition. So we were also a link to the fact that what is the actual final definition of the microcredentials, so that we could also take forward our guidelines and principles. And then another tool we actually discussed was the ECTS. And one way this tool was seen easier to agree within the working group. ECTS is very known, I suppose, by many of us participating today this event. And it goes back years and years and years, and originally developed for the mobility purposes. Not even for the degree programs, but the mobility to describe a piece of learning in a form that would be transparent and understandable for others. Nowadays, of course, it is important to remember that ECTS comprises two different kinds of issues. It's the learning outcomes. We have said a lot about today about the learning outcomes, which are the descriptions of what competencies the learner is able to demonstrate at the end of the learning experience. And the other one is the volume of learning, understood as the amount of time a normal learner will need to form those competencies. But we also discussed about the other aspects of the ECTS, and this is the course catalog. And you know, microcredentials could be also included into these course catalogs together with other information the higher education institutions are already providing. But in this regard, we also noted the development in terms of digital services and data repositories, and it's important to think about in the future how we will take forward ECTS course catalogs and the discussion about the other catalogs, so that we want to overlapping kind of exercises here. And that is the reason why I have written there that microcredentials should not be developed separately from the existing higher education system, from the existing processes and progress that is being made in terms of the whole development of the higher education. End result of the discussion was that the ECTS should be used for microcredentials provided by higher education institutions. And that's it. But it was also recognized that, of course, ECTS could be something that is for interest also for alternative providers, let's say employers or other providers, third parties, so to say. And in this respect, there was a lot of discussion how this can be achieved, because it is very important that ECTS understood and implemented correctly. Of course, we know that there are also some other restrictions to be able to use the ECTS if you are not a higher education institution. And here, as Kiara actually already said, our conclusion at the time is that the way forward is the cooperation agreement between the higher education institutions and alternative providers to be taken forward the ECTS for microcredentials. At last but not least, I already said it, but ECTS, as dear and as recognizable and known it is for us, needs to be implemented correctly. And its many facets needs to be better known, not only by academics, by us, but also to other stakeholders. And in this regard, we have 3 recommendations in terms of ECTS. We need to ensure that the existing ECTS user guide is well known and correctly followed by higher education institutions, and its different elements need to be communicated clearly to the other stakeholders. And if deemed useful, formulate a simple guide forward to the relevant existing ECTS principles and fair theatres to facilitate the correct understanding and take-up of ECTS to microcredentials. Last, encourage cooperation between the higher education institutions and other sectors, as well as private providers, alternative providers, whatever we call them, in order to facilitate the correct definition of learning outcomes and the indication of the workload, as well as co-creation of learning activities. One of the added value of the microcredentials when we discussed in the working group was exactly the point of cooperation. The microcredentials can actually provide the tool how higher education institutions can cooperate with other providers, with the employers, with the society in a large perspective. And this is something that we see can be also enabled by the tools of Bologna. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonna. And we do have a few minutes for questions. When talking about the EQF, we at least used to talk about meaningful units. A microcredential seems to be too small for these references, and a similar concern also comes from another person who's following online, asking whether microcredentials are not per definition too small to be assigned to the NQF or EQF. And if it wouldn't overburden the NQF instrument. So please.
Thank you, and thank you. Your questions were strictly to the spot of the discussions within the working group. And as you heard, we don't have a recommendation for certain ECTS credit range for microcredentials. Of course, we noted that there were preferences in some cases between, for example, 5 ECTS to 15 or 30, but in some cases we had examples of microcredentials being something like 30 to 60. So in the time when we are still trying to find out what can be actually achieved by the microcredentials in addition to what we already have, we thought that it's better to be flexible. But having said this, we also understood that, when we talk about 1 or 2 ECTS, exactly, it might be a bit too small unit to include to the NQF as such, depending on the process at the national level, how the NQFs are actually developed. So in this regard, you can understand the formulation that the microcredentials should be included in NQF when possible. This is exactly the reason behind the formulation.
Thank you. Another question. Do we know to what extent existing microcredentials at higher education institutions already use the learning outcome approach? It's a question from the audience.
This, of course, depends probably how microcredentials are understood in different institutions and different countries. I don't have a statistics or kind of a state of play at the moment, but based on the discussions, I would presume that when microcredentials are seeing something that are developed as extracted from the degree programs or intermediate qualifications, etc., somehow linked to the way higher education institutions have already developed their degree leading education, they are using the learning outcomes. But when we started to discuss more about the so-called other kind of provision not leading to degree, there were a bit more variety within the institutions and countries. So I would say that the fine line might be found from these.
Could member states' current limitations on the usage of ECTS, like for example minimum volume, be an obstacle for the development of micro-credentials?
This also links to the fact that what I didn't say as regards the NQFs, I think, is that, you know, we have different stages in general when the member states are currently developing the micro-credentials, because they are understood a bit differently. In some cases, they are maybe something that already exists, a bit re-wrapped for the purposes of lifelong learning. And, you know, as regards the ECTS or the NQFs, you know, we have systems that are more limited in the terms that they are for degree leading studies, and that's it. And then we have member states who have started to open their NQFs and maybe use of ECTS as well to also micro-credentials, but the steps are still to be taken forward, and we are in the different stages. And I hope that actually our chair of today, Bakali, will probably touch upon a bit about the way forward later, so I don't say forward, more words about this. But I think we are in between of the progress at the moment.
Okay, I just heard there's room for one more question, so I'll ask the question that also came in. A question here from someone in the audience. Learning outcomes represent capabilities. Employers seek competencies. Are you therefore enabling translation of learning outcomes within your micro-credential approach? So in general, I think we're asking mostly about the link between what we present here today and what employers seek.
Yes, this was discussed, and it was said that, you know, probably for the employers, well, it was seen that the learning outcomes, you know, the way how we can present what a learner has achieved in terms of skills, knowledge, and competencies, it's important. But this also goes to the discussion very deep about the way how we actually verbalize. How do we describe the learning outcomes? And this was one of the points when we discussed about the learning outcomes and the ECTS in general, that there probably needs to be more work done in terms of implementation of the tools that we already have, so that we probably get more added value from them.
Well, thank you very much, Jonna, but also colleagues Elena and Chiara for this very interesting and extensive discussion about the link between the micro-credentials and the 3 Bologna key commitments. Now, let us proceed with our program for today. And we will move now to a panel of our MICROBOL experts and associate partner. And I would like to give the floor to our moderator of the panel, Maria Kello of EUA. And please, also for the online audience, you can still ask questions also to our panelists. So keep on putting your questions in the Q&A box online. Thank you very much, and I wish you a lot of success with the panel.
Thank you very much, Magali. So my name is Maria Kela, and I'm the Director for Institutional Development Unit at the European University Association, EUA, which is one of the partners in the MICROBOL project. I'm here with 6 experts, or when I say here, it's partly here and partly online. This is supposedly the hybrid format that we will increasingly see in our events. I will very quickly introduce them to you. We have Anthony Camilleri, who is the tertiary education policy consultant and founder of the Knowledge Innovation Center. Frederic de Decker, who is head of International Relations Office at the University of Ghent. And Catherine Isaacs, who is a Bologna expert, and also until 2020, the vice chair of the Bologna follow-up group. George Ubax, Managing Director of the European Association of Distance Teaching Universities, and Colin Tuck, Director of ECAR, the European Quality Assurance Register, and Peter van der Heijden, who is a Higher Education Strategy Advisor, will be joining us in just a moment here on the stage. So the purpose of this final panel is really to take stock of what we have achieved in the MICROBOL project. We have heard all the details about the different recommendations, but I wanted to hear from our experts, what do they think were the key outcomes of this project, and perhaps even more importantly so, how can they be used in the future and be also used as a contribution into the Bologna process, as well as in the reinforcement of the European education area and the European Union strategy for universities. And as Magali already said, we are happy to get your questions from the audience as well, so keep them coming through the chat. To kick off the conversation, I would like to ask our experts what is, in their view, the most important outcome of the MICROBOL project, or which element they would really like to highlight to their participants, also reflecting their specific background, because each of our experts brings something special to the group. So I would like to start with Anthony. Anthony, what do you think has been the best outcome of the MICROBOL project?
Thanks a lot, Maria. So I think to answer that question, we have to go back in time a little bit to the beginning of the project. And about 3 years ago or so, it wasn't obvious at all that, let's say, micro-credentials had a role in higher education institutions, that Bologna would be appropriate for it, and so on and so forth. And one of the things you'll see running through all the deliverables of the project is an understanding that actually micro-credentials dovetail very, very nicely with the original aims of the Bologna process. They can help mobility, they can help student choice, they can help internationalization. And not surprisingly, one of the things you will see also throughout the deliverables is that the Bologna tools, even though not made for micro-credentials, actually work quite well in most of the situations. And that actually, especially when it comes to provision of micro-credentials, there are no real barriers, in the sense that there are no barriers that would really stop institutions from going down this path with enthusiasm. Another thing that we see across is that, let's say, there are two levels of difficulty, I would say, when implementing micro-credentials. One is staying entirely within the higher education system, and this to some extent is the easy level. We already know how to trade credits between courses. We understand how to work with other higher education institutions. But when we start going outside higher education and start trying to use micro-credentials as a form of mobility between sectors or between the labor market and institutions and so on and so forth, there's still a lot of work to do, and we're just starting to scrape the surface of the possibilities of recognition between sectors. One of the interesting things over here, which you kind of find in between the lines, is that the quality models we have developed for higher education, there may be a scope to export them outside exclusively higher education, and also start thinking of them as a model for, let's say, higher micro-credentials generally, irrespective of the type of institution offering them. The last thing I would point out, which is one of the things which I take, let's say, most satisfaction in, is that there is no talk of supplements in any of the deliverables. To some extent, we are killing this idea of supplements and saying that, listen, data-rich credentials, which explain your learning outcomes and skills with some element of sophistication, should be the default. You shouldn't have a credential which, let's say, gives a summary and a supplement to translate that credential to people, but rather one data-rich credential as default. I'll leave it there for starters.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Anthony. Maybe also in your other comments, other experts want to comment on yours, but we'll see about that. Anyway, Frederick, what do you think were the key outcomes of MICROBOL? What did you like best?
Well, Maria, I'm especially happy, I must say, that in the project we have come to the conclusion that all these tools and instruments and these key concepts that we have been developing over the last decades to use at the level of our degree programs in higher education also work very well for smaller and in some cases even rather small amounts of learning. I'm thinking of the typical Bologna key such as learning outcomes, and we found out that this focus on results also works very well for these small learning experiences rather than focusing on content or on learning formats, etc. The same is true for credits, which means that the concept of workload linked to the achievement of these learning outcomes also works pretty well, and it is a concept that can be applied to these small volumes of learning. Also for the qualifications frameworks and the levels attached to these, I agree with some of the questions that were asked that this is challenging, but it proves to be possible also indeed for these smaller trunks of learning. And I think the last element I want to highlight there is the QA principles as laid down in the European standards and guidelines, which I think are a very distinctive feature for higher education, and we should use that to our benefit, I think, when we are working out these micro-credentials. And I think, and I'm very confident and hopeful about that, that this should boost what has been a priority in the European higher education area for years, but seemed rather difficult to achieve for many higher education institutions, that is offering more flexible, more student-centered learning opportunities, not only within systems, but also across systems. And for instance, within these European university alliances that are now emerging, I think these offers an interesting opportunity to test this. Because, and that's the final element I would like to highlight for now, I'm confident that the work that we've done within the MICROBOL project will facilitate this recognition of various learning experiences, also, as I said, across these systems, using as was highlighted by Chiara, these recognition procedures in line with the Lisbon Recognition Convention, and also, and I'm very happy because I think in higher education we have not used the potential of that until now sufficiently for the recognition of prior experiential learning.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Frederick. I think it is indeed very encouraging to see that all the tools that we have worked very hard to put in place in the last 20 years in the Bologna process, or even more than 20 years, are useful. They can be used for innovative, new, different forms of learning, like micro-credentials. George, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think that the strength of the MICROBOL project was indeed the momentum, the timing of launching it at the moment that we already had a feeling and signals that there is a call for shorter programs that are more accessible and flexible, online programs, and then shortly after that, of course, also the demand for a fit qualification for these shorter programs, as that is missing for continuing education. So momentum was very important, then also the experts represented in the working groups and so on, not only for the expertise, but also for being carriers of the results of the project now as a follow-up. Of course, MICROBOL focusing on the Bologna tools, and very much rightly so, as we also did within our European MOOC consortium on the Common Microcredential Framework, also immediately looking at the Bologna tools for making it possible to integrate them later on in the educational systems, but also very much in line with the European educational policies, and therefore also contributing to the consultation groups by the European Commission, and eventually also to the Council recommendation. The focus of MICROBOL on higher education further was important to give a microcredential really an identity, because only in formal education you can give the identity and the transparency for later on being recognized also. So it gives really the potential of being part of the educational system and being integrated in that. In all, I believe that the MICROBOL framework now is very much an important reference tool, a reference framework for the further discussion at national level and institutional level, which is now triggered by the Council recommendation, to further discuss the integration of microcredentials and using this as a reference model. And also all the discussions and consultations that we had within MICROBOL to not do these in all member states separately, again, starting from scratch, but taking already the discussions and considerations that we have had in MICROBOL. And lastly, it very much is also supporting our and confirming our approach of our common microcredential framework of the European MOOC Consortium, of which we already have some 50 microcredentials launched on a dedicated portal. So it is very much supporting also running initiatives, and will support also new initiatives and the follow-up at the member states.
Thank you, George. I'm also very pleased of that comment, because that was also my perception, that in MICROBOL we have managed to create the connections and actually really feed into the different policy processes at the European Commission level, of course, at the framework we heard about earlier today, but also for the Bologna process. Because sometimes there has been frustration while things have progressed perhaps in parallel rather than in conjunction. So that was a very good point, worthy of underlining. Before I ask Marielle whether we have any questions from the audience, I would like to turn to Colin Turk from ECAR. I think, Colin, your perspective might be a little bit different from the other colleagues we have just heard, in the sense that you come from a very specific organization, and I wanted to ask you how you see the impact, or what are the consequences of the establishment of micro-credentials, perhaps in growing numbers, to quality assurance, and what is the role of the quality assurance register and the DECAR database eventually in this respect? Colin.
Yes, thank you, Maria. So I think on the one hand, it's already clear that the impact is already quite big in that we are discussing these topics, micro-credentials, and what will be the impact of that quite intensely. So on the one hand, the ECHA registered quality assurance agencies are already quite active in that they are evaluating and accrediting also micro-credentials, even outside of higher education institutions. But nevertheless, I want to divide a little bit between micro-credentials by higher education institutions and then other so-called alternative providers, because for higher education institutions, I'm quite confident that on the one hand, the institutions will embed their micro-credential offer in their own internal quality assurance arrangements, and also that the quality assurance agencies will be quite successful in including those micro-credential offers in their external quality audits and accreditations at institutional level. And as Elena has said it before, we don't really expect there that external quality assurance would happen at the level of the individual micro-credential, because that would be far too complicated. So we are looking more at institutional approaches. Of course, there are some countries where external quality assurance is now focused entirely on the study program. So I think in those cases, it will require a bit more thinking, because we cannot just copy-paste that to micro-credentials. So we might need to end up with a system where maybe study programs, full bachelor master programs are externally accredited as such, and then micro-credentials, the whole micro-credential offer is maybe institutionally reviewed. But I think that still I'm fairly confident that agencies will sort that out and will find solutions that are appropriate in their setting. So on the DECA database, we will simply have to make transparent what the different kind of institutional reviews cover. But I think the elephant in the room are really the alternative providers, and that's where we have most of the discussions about, of course, because some of the ECHA registered agencies are already using the ESG to review micro-credentials offered by non-recognized higher education institutions, by private companies or others. And also importantly here, I think, contrary to what we expect for higher education institutions, this will probably be more often at the level of the single credential. What does that mean for DECA? On the one hand, I think it became very clear from the discussions in MICROBOL that we will need to find a place for alternative providers and the micro-credentials they have that have been accredited or certified in line with the ESG from those providers. I think it's clear they need to find a place in DECA somehow, because the ESG are used in that sphere. But at the same time, we are discussing the modalities of that currently. And I think two important points here on most importantly, I think the really full transparency of the different types of providers and the different stages. So we want to be sure that it needs to be absolutely clear for everyone what is a recognized higher education institution that provides formally recognized bachelor master degrees, and what is an alternative provider that provides micro-credentials or other similar kind of offers at higher education level, but that does not mean that this is a formally recognized higher education institution. So both will need to have their place, but I think it needs to be absolutely clear which is which, so that there's no misinformation or confusion of the public. And in particular, I think that needs to be sure in terms of the terminology that is used, because we have clear established terminology like bachelor, master, university, college, higher education institution that needs to be clearly reserved for recognized institutions. So we don't want to blur the image. We want to be very clear which kind of institution has which kind of status. And one last point I want to mention, of course, what is very important, I think at this point of the discussion, is that of course the ESG that are established for higher education, they are used for micro-credential providers and for alternative providers, but that's of course an opt-in scenario, I would say. I mean, there's no one who can force any provider to use anything. So there is a choice that certain providers will want to use the ESG and certain agencies will want to use the ESG to certify those providers. But of course, it's perfectly valid that some might choose different approaches. So it's an optional use of the ESG. It's not obligatory use, I would say. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Colin. It seems that we have a couple of questions from the audience, so let's hear.
Yes, a few questions came in indeed, Maria. Let's first go to a couple of questions regarding ECTS, in fact. Someone asks here, in the papers I didn't see any limitation of the scope in credits for micro-credentials, and the question is specifically whether this was a conscious decision by the MICROBOL project. So maybe you could elaborate a bit on that, but I'd like to connect that to another question too. Let me just scroll through my list, sorry. Another question regarding ECTS, namely micro-credentials often use competence-based learning that does not require counting learning time. How can we fit that to the ECTS where duration is a key indicator? So if you could address these two questions regarding ECTS, please.
Good. Thank you, Marielle. I think that's an interesting question. ECTS, where duration is a key indicator, they already provokes perhaps some thoughts in some of our experts. Who feels ready to give it a go? Peter van der Heijden, please.
Yeah. Okay. Now, as far as ECTS is concerned, we then spontaneously think about the credit range. And there my answer is, as my answer is to most questions, anything goes. It would be strange to have a micro-credential of 65, but 55 is still, you could still define it as a micro-credential. It doesn't matter. It's what the provider provides us. And as you demonstrate from the European MOOCs, the CMF, they have decided for themselves a standard. And that is good. Like you have cars have different standards, or the iPhone has a different size. You have to make up your mind as a provider. But in theory and in practice, it doesn't. Now, in practice, it matters. In theory, it doesn't matter. But ECTS is much more than the credit range. ECTS is the course catalog. It's the learning outcomes. It's the transcript of records. So it's all the transparency around ECTS that makes it extremely useful for this new kid on the block called micro-credentials.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Anybody else who wants to add to that briefly? Are we ready for the next question?
All right.
Okay, let's go for the next question then.
Sorry. Yeah, let's elaborate a little bit further. I have a statement actually here. Someone is putting out a statement saying credits or hours are only data that help in the question of recognition of learning outcomes, and thus the question of whether or not recognition can be granted. Do you agree? That's the question. Yeah. Did we catch it? Shall I just repeat it one more time?
Yes, repeat it once more.
It's a bit of a complicated statement. Credits or hours are only data that help in the question of recognition of learning outcomes, and thus the question of whether or not recognition can be granted. And do you agree?
Yeah, Frederic.
Yeah, I would like to say that for recognition, you take many different elements into account. And of course, credits is just one element that you look at while you are considering recognition or not. And of course, credits, they express a certain value, and a volume can play a determinant role in making a decision on the recognition or not, but you do that together with all the other elements that are important for recognition purposes. And so it links a bit to the previous question, and as was said by Peter, there is a lot more to ECTS and also to credits than just the hours. It's all the other elements that we also should take into account, not only in the provision of micro-credentials, but also in the recognition of these.
Yeah, good. I think perhaps the hours is the least of the problems or issues. It's what really the learner comes out with in terms of learning outcomes that we care about more. Good. Thank you. Before I go to Kathy and Peter for some very difficult, specific questions, get ready for some bigger reflections on the bigger picture about the EHEA, about the European education area. I would like to have a second round with Anthony, Colin, Frederic, and George, now in terms of the future. So what do you think are the most important next steps in ensuring that the thorough and appropriate integration of the micro-credentials happens in the higher education systems and structures, and what do you see as the key challenges in doing that? And let me mix the cards a little bit. Let's start with George.
Yeah, first, in next steps, I believe that in the ambition of recognizing the micro-credentials as a qualification, and EQF and NQF, we have to build a kind of an ecosystem for continuing education that in which the qualification or qualifications find their existence, find their position. And a micro-credential can be, for example, one layer, but you can also think about micro-credentials being stackable to a micro-degree, maybe later even to a full degree. So that we have to think and explore the position of micro-credentials in the continuing education positioning of qualifications. So that's to be explored and to be established. And secondly, we have to think about, as a next step, is to bringing micro-credentials into a reality, meaning that universities are currently exploring their position towards offering continuing education, because it's not for all universities a common practice. And universities are exploring extension schools, for example, or centers for continuing education. And in that, it's not only by introducing micro-credentials, but it's also about thinking about student support for continuing education, but also being an interface between academia and the labor market to develop responsive, relevant micro-credentials. So that is the development of a basis for micro-credentials. There are at this moment just running projects to support that, and you have to think about also about modularization as part of developing continuing education, modularization by micro-credentials. And there are two ways. That is to have bigger programs that you cut down in smaller pieces to micro-credentials, or you start a process of developing smaller courses of micro-credentials. But that is all further to be explored in the next steps.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, George. Let me go to one of my online panelists. Anthony, what do you think is the future? What do we have to do next?
Well, what we have to do next, I mean, we still have a lot left to do, honestly. And I would say that in terms of barriers, the thing that probably requires the most work is recognition. So Chiara had already spoken a little bit about the challenges in her talk, but if you look at recognition today, the current recognition processes we have are extremely time consuming. They are not scalable. They will not support millions of students taking micro-credentials per year and having those micro-credentials recognized. So moving towards automatic or semi-automatic recognition of micro-credentials, I would say, is the hardest and most important thing that is still on our menu. Number two, if I basically, as has, let's say, seen from the questions, there's a lot of skepticism around, let's say, this issue of measuring hours linked to skills. One of the things we need to think about is that when we go into micro-credentials, it's not enough to say that a person has learned a skill. You need to be able to say that a person has learned a skill up to a certain level. We don't have formal level-based competence frameworks for most skills or for most professions, which is why we have to use a course indicator like ours instead. But again, if we want to enable recognition between recognition of micro-credentials, we need these frameworks, we need these level indicators to be able to facilitate that recognition. Last thing I would say is that once we get into the micro-credentials area, alternate providers start coming into the picture. So you don't have a lot of private companies who are offering degrees to their workers, but practically every large company offers micro-credentials to their learners, and a lot of those would probably map to qualification frameworks in the higher education levels. So figuring out what happens when we start having companies at large scale offering qualifications in terms of micro-credentials and how we then enable the portability of those micro-credentials between institutions and companies is also one of the challenges that I think we're going to have to start discussing in coming years.
Thanks, Anthony. So time could be kind of considered as a proxy for depth or width of learning, so that we know a little bit a direction of how much of that matter the student has been exposed to. And yes, alternative providers is a tricky one, and we had intentionally decided in this project to really focus on the higher education, thinking, okay, it is we do have a framework, and that's the whole idea, to see how much we can meet that framework, but alternative providers, we really need to think about that. So you're right, Anthony, we have quite a bit of work to do. I think we have more work to do than what we have done, but okay, we shouldn't, we won't be unemployed in the short term if that is to be taken into consideration. Frederick, what do you think are the key future actions?
Well, I think the most important next step for me, for higher education institutions to take, is to use the specific dynamics that is now around by the attention for micro-credentials. And you're right, we still have a lot of work to do, but I do think that we as the MICROBOL team have played an important role in adding to that dynamics. And I think this dynamic should lead to higher education institutions to really take on their societal responsibility with regard to the enhancement of lifelong learning, a role I think that has been, generally speaking, a bit neglected by universities in the past. And I think in that respect we should use some of our unique selling propositions to enhance our role in lifelong learning, which for me links to this use and this experience with the use of the Bologna tools that I was earlier referring to. We can easily guarantee the quality. We can very easily define the learning outcomes and attached credits, level these micro-credentials, etc. Using the vast experience we have in our degree programs. And I'm very glad to see that this is already happening, including in my own institution, in Kent University, in the framework not only of our new lifelong learning policy, but already with links to the regular, to our degree programs, so to say. And at the same time, I think the key challenge is very much linked to this. That is to ensure that these micro-credentials really fulfill their promise to act as a kind of catalysts for inclusion in higher education. And we heard a number of speakers this afternoon making reference to this. And I mean then inclusion in the broad sense, that is enhanced possibilities to access higher education, for recognition of these partial qualifications that can then be stacked into full qualifications, for recognition of prior experiential learning, etc. And I'm convinced that also the digitalization of the credentials in itself should play a key role in taking up this role from the university perspective, since this can significantly lower the threshold and make it easier for this recognition based on portability, reliability, and transparency. So we are definitely not there yet, but I perceive the work that we and others have done regarding micro-credentials as an essential piece of this Bologna puzzle, if you could look at it from that perspective, which seem to have been lacking so far, this specific element, which is now providing us, at least at the European level, a kind of common language, and George was also referring to that earlier, about such small learning experiences. And so in a lot of meetings that I have been currently participating in, there is very often reference to these micro-credentials and what these stand for and what these could stand for, including in the context, for instance, of our European University and Light, where we have had a couple of specific meetings on that. And so I'm hence looking very much forward to what this will bring for the next couple of years, and I'm very confident that this will be a very important step in the further implementation of the European higher education area.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for that positive note. Glass half full.
Yeah.
Colin, what about you? What do you think?
Thanks. Well, I mean, one part is maybe that would be a bit stating the obvious. Of course, I think it's good that we have this clear recommendations from the MICROBOL project, but now will still be a long road to actually implement all that framework and all the ideas, and to prove that fully in reality at all different levels, that the Bologna tools can be used for micro-credentials. So I think there's still a lot of work to do. But as I said, that's a bit stating the obvious. But to add something to that, I'm sorry for coming back to alternative providers once again. But I think that's still a point where we need maybe also to broaden the question a little bit, because so far we have been discussing very much, okay, can the Bologna tools be used for micro-credentials? Yes, they can. Not only for higher education institutions, but even for alternative providers. We see that it's quite clear. There's nothing in there that would be unapplicable or that couldn't be translated to micro-credentials. But I think we also need to look a bit further what is not in the current Bologna tools, because there are a lot of things that we take for granted in higher education. And I'm thinking here about academic freedom, basic academic values. I'm also thinking of the fact that education is based on science, on the scientific method. And all these things are not explicitly mentioned in any of our Bologna tools, because I think we have been taking them for granted very much in the higher education. And I mean, we are in very sad times now. We have seen in the last week that a lot of things we cannot take for granted, not even in the European higher education area. But I think especially when we think of using these tools for alternative providers, we need to think also, okay, how do we deal with those things that we have been taking for granted in higher education, and how do we ensure that these kind of basic principles and basic values are also upheld for alternative providers if what they offer wants to call itself higher education? How do we make sure that it is scientific, that it respects freedom of research and so on? And I think that's that part of the question we should also ask more in the future when we reach out to alternative providers.
Next, I would like to move from, let's say, specific, more concrete remarks onto equally concrete, perhaps, but at the macro level. I would like to ask Kathy. You can, of course, also make some comments on the MICROBOL project in general, briefly in line with what the others have been saying, but I would particularly like to hear what is your view on the contribution of the MICROBOL project and the outcomes that we have created into the priorities of the current work plan of the Bologna process?
Well, thank you, Maria, for this very important question. And of course, I feel moved to react to a lot of the interesting points that have been made by my fellow panel members. However, I also think that it's very important to consider how this will fit into the future of Bologna. And it's very interesting, as was hinted before by several. Micro-credentials have been around for a long time, but not with a definition, in a chaotic sort of a way, and they've always seemed to be outside of Bologna with its emphasis on qualification levels and on cycles and so forth, and so full degree programs. And it's interesting that in the previous work period, the one leading up to Rome Online, the most challenging task that the BFUG had to face was to generate a vision of the European higher education area in 2030. And it did so working together, describing a future which was supposed to be, and we hope will be, of course, inclusive, innovative, interconnected, as appears in the communique. And that forward-looking framework suddenly made it appear necessary to emphasize flexible learning paths and opening higher education provision to the needs of a much greater range of learners or potential learners, let's say. Particularly, this is important in my view, who suddenly became not just the classical full-time student enrolled in a degree program, but almost everyone, almost everyone before higher education studies, during them, after them, according to economic, professional needs, the changing workplace, indeed, the changing world, and their cultural and personal needs or desires as well. And it's interesting because I'm not sure this was the first time, but we did organize some really interesting and important, intense discussions in the BFUG itself in some breakout sessions. And one of these was about whether EHEA tools, Bologna tools, could be used for micro-credentials. And the mission of MICROBOL has been to tease out the details of this whether and how. And not surprisingly, in my view, the verdict we have received from MICROBOL is yes. As Frederick said, great, it's wonderful. What we have done over the past, I would say, 30 and more years, considering ECTS, is that the EHEA tools are very suitable to micro-credentials if, and this is a pretty big if maybe, if understood and applied correctly in, and here's another important factor, in an agreed and coordinated manner. And as we know in the Rome communique, the ministers asked the BFUG to explore how and to what extent these smaller flexible units, including those leading to micro-credentials, can be defined, developed, implemented, and recognized by our institutions using EHEA tools. Well, in the current work period that started, excuse me, at the beginning of 21 and will go on until the spring of 24, the actors that I see most closely involved are the three thematic peer groups of the Bologna Implementation Coordination Group, of which I'm one of the co-chairs. Each is responsible for one of the key commitments of the Bologna process, which are the QF, ECTS, DS, QA, Lisbon Recognition Convention. And these correspond exactly, not by chance, to the three strands of MICROBOL. And each one of these thematic peer groups that involve all the EHE countries have in their work plans a strand on micro-credentials. So the BICG itself has the task of coordinating these thematic peer groups and also reporting on the results to the BFUG. And I think here is a very important opportunity for ensuring that micro-credentials receive the appropriate attention in the next communique, which will be a big factor in being sure that the approach is indeed agreed and coordinated. But above all, that countries themselves explore ways in which they can make sure that their higher education institutions and communities, higher education communities, share a common understanding of micro-credentials and how to include them in their systems using the Bologna tools. That is the framework. I would say the Working Group on Teaching and Learning of the BFUG is obviously working also on micro-credentials. They put them in their report to the last work period. There is also the task force on enhancing knowledge sharing and the EHEA. And well, what can I say about the consultative members of the EHEA, such as ENCA, ECAR, and the EUA? These will be very, very important in ensuring that HEIs or that higher education institutions are informed and know how to use the so-called old, I guess, Bologna tools in what will be a new way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy, indeed. So it's clear micro-credentials have an important role in the European higher education area context, but I think also in the European education area context. So, Peter, how do you see the role of micro-credentials in the new EU strategy for universities, perhaps in the European University Alliances, in the whole package of what the Commission is brewing up in terms of new initiatives in higher education? How do you think those then linked with the European higher education area, and what is the role of the MICROBOL in all of this? So you have 2 minutes. No, just you have a couple of more minutes.
A very important role, I would say. It's a very fine nose of the Bologna community that they put this so high on their agenda and to work on it. And for me, when I take part and when I observe, I see that the micro-credentials are a microcosmos. And in this microcosmos of the micro-credentials, all the policies come together. They're amplified and they're exemplified. Things like transnational, transparency, mobility, quality, all these issues that we talk about for many years, they get suddenly a new urgency. It was like with the joint degrees. What about the quality of a joint degree? Working groups, etc. Now, micro-credentials. The first reflex is, how about the recognition? How about the transparency? How about the quality? Well, we have an answer. Yeah, we have ECTS, we have the ENQA, we have the ECAR and the other actors. It all gets a new urgency. We're living in a time of diversification, enormous diversification and flexibility. It's also a trend that UNESCO wants to address in 2 months in the World Conference. The EU, in its strategy, talks about the skills mismatches. Well, definitely micro-credentials have a role, because our degree programs, how much we love them, they cannot cater for all. So we need to do something on skills mismatches through diversification and through flexibility. The green and the digital come out clearly with the online provision, etc. Certification. Where do I find the proof? Well, now we have the student card, we have the Europass, we have the blockchain. So the answers are in the air. The problem is in the air, the answers are in the air. We just have to fit the pieces of the puzzle together, and that's what we did. That's what we did in this report of this group. The European University Alliances, this new club, I think there are a few hundred now, in soon to be 60 alliances. That's very powerful, because they are little labs. They're supposed to do new things. Well, they are all starting to pool, upscale their micro-credential production and to tailor it, because in Finland it's different from Spain. The examples are different, so you have to deliver tailor work. Also in quality assurance, I call it quality assurance new style, because we are used to the periodic reviews. And it's good that you have this very serious visit and report, etc. But it takes time, and it will stay. It's important. But now we have real-time reviews. A lousy lecture series on a Tuesday morning, it can stay for months. It can stay for years. I can tell you, a lousy online course will be removed within 1 week. 1 week. The degree students, they're hostages. They cannot run away with their feet. But an online student, they will vote with their mouse. If the course is not clear, the sound is bad, or the teacher feedback is not up to scratch. Bye-bye. That's a new dimension to QA. And the QA professionals, I'm sure you do that at ENQA, will take that on board. And they will use that in their coaching, in their guidance, and indeed in their periodic reviews. And that's a brave new world that we're in. And this report will enormously help in addressing the issues.
Excellent. Very good, Peter. Thank you very much. We are coming to the end of our time for this panel, but I've been told that there is a question from the audience, and as we do want to take you as participants in this big auditorium where we're sitting, with a couple of people, we will feel more connected to you through your questions. So, Marielle, if there is a question, please go ahead.
Yes, I think we have time for one more question, don't we, right? One or two. So we have a question that came in regarding the stacking of micro-credentials. Someone asks, could you say stacking micro-credentials up to a degree is similar to dividing a course into course units, but reversed, with the difference that smaller units take primacy. So can we say that micro-credentials are the reverse of course units in a bigger program? Right. Okay, stacking. This is one of our favorite topics as well. Who wants to be the first to go? Because I suppose there are different opinions on this. In the screen also, lift your hand if you want to.
Just 2 words. Excellent comparison.
Excellent comparison, yes.
Yeah.
George?
On the other hand, we have to also consider that those students who want to take a micro-credential do not have the ambition of taking a full degree. That's why they take a micro-credential. So the stackability is a means to build for micro-credentials, maybe to a micro-degree, possibly not a full degree, but it helps, it gives the incentive for a student to further educate, but maybe not the target group for a full degree.
Mm-hmm. So the primary objective perhaps is not that. Kathy, followed by Anthony.
No, from my point of view, it's important to understand, I think, that stackability doesn't mean simply getting enough credits to make a degree. No. It means that some micro-credentials can be stacked. They can be considered part of a larger degree, but their main purpose is in pursuing the flexible learning paths that may come, as we've said, at any time. And so it's not to be considered that stackability is an obligation, it's a choice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good, yeah, indeed. Yeah. Anthony.
Yeah, I'll follow it up by saying I actually disagree with the statement completely. So, so the point of micro-credentials isn't just breaking down a degree and restacking it in reverse. The point is, at the moment, if I want to further my education, I have to take this pre-arranged package of credits from a single university. Now I have new opportunities with micro-credentials. I can take exactly the credit I need from any institution in the world that furthers my specific learning pathway. Mm-hmm. And also from a university perspective, it means that every micro-credential has to be top quality, because every micro-credential is individually now in this global market, rather than having your really strong ones and your slightly weakers all bundled into these packages.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, excellent point, Anthony, I think. And it's like your business card. So if a student gets a lousy micro-credential from a good university, however good, it really leaves a stain. So be careful, be on your toes. Universities, only high-quality micro-credentials. Our time is up, so I would like to thank very much the panelists. I had a very good time having a conversation with you. online, offline, it seems to make no difference. It's a one big family here. So thank you, everybody. The difference is only that those who are here in person will now soon go for a drink. But, you know, you can toast together with us from distance. Thank you to all the participants from my part. It's very nice that you stuck around and also posed some questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mara.
Well, thank you very much also from my side to all the panelists for your expertise and sharing your thoughts with us during this panel discussion. So here we are at the end of our final conference. Dear colleagues, dear guests, in the MICROBOL project we have put the puzzle pieces together. The main conclusion of our project is that the Bologna tools are applicable to micro-credentials. And we feel that they can even give a new boost to the full implementation of the Bologna tools and key commitments. But as already said several times today, in order to strive for the effective implementation and uptake of micro-credentials in the European higher education area, we do have to invest in further dialogue. Therefore, we should take up the framework that has been created now within the Bologna process, and more specifically through the Bologna thematic peer groups, in their working programs for the period 2021-2024. And this is also what we will do. Together with the co-chairs of the different thematic peer groups, we have put the topic of micro-credentials on our agendas. That way we can ensure that the follow-up of MICROBOL working groups is there. And in these further processes, we must also involve all actors. These are, of course, the higher education institutions, the public authorities, the recognition bodies, but also the employers, the students, the trade unions, the assessment providers, etc. And in order to have all these actors on board and to promote a common understanding among them, it might be useful to develop guiding documents for these different actors, as we might have to give them some more explanation on how to use our existing tools. We also have to invest in peer learning and in exchange of good practices. The outcomes of the survey and the discussions in the working groups clearly brought this forward throughout our project. We also realized that the scope of our project was limited. Therefore, there are still some aspects that should still be addressed in the future. And just to name a few of them as an example, we could discuss to what extent the offer of these small units of learning and these flexible pathways are desirable in higher education. How to include micro-credentials in our funding schemes within our higher education regulations. How can alternative providers be included within our QA systems and in a possible list of trusted providers? How to simplify recognition of micro-credentials offered from outside of Europe? What is the role of private micro-credential platforms and their certification and quality assurance requirements in this overall micro-credential ecosystem? These and a lot more questions, because also our panelists already mentioned some topics that we still need to discuss. So this is some work for the coming years. Because the MICROBOL project and the MICROBOL framework is a starting point. We are at the end of our project, but we are still at the starting point. Now we need to invest in further dialogue, collaboration, and uptake of micro-credentials in the European higher education area. Now we are ready for the next steps. Before closing down this final conference, I would like to take the opportunity to thank our project partners and experts for their expertise, their enthusiasm, and their professional way of cooperation throughout the project. And of course, I would also like to thank the many representatives of the countries and the stakeholder organizations whose input was very valuable during the working groups and the other activities of the project. All of you together made this project to success. So thank you very much, and I'm sure we will be in touch in the near future. Bye-bye.